Welcome to the second episode of the True Progress Podcast, presented by Perfectus Magazine. If you're unfamiliar with Perfectus, we're an online magazine dedicated to featuring thoughtful writing, engaging interviews, and unique artwork focused on the intersection of academic literature, public policy, civilizational progress, and human flourishing. In this three-part series, we delve into one of the most literally dividing issues facing Americans and the world today: polarization. Undoubtedly, it's something you've heard of and possibly even felt. It's all around you and affects your relationships, your interactions, your daily life, from home to work and back. But what is polarization exactly? And is it really as bad and pervasive as you may think it is? And most importantly, what can we do about it? In episode 1, we set the scene and define what polarization is. Then, in episode 2, we explore its effects on society. And finally, in episode 3, we look for solutions and paths forward. Let's dive in. Episode 2, Fracturing Society. In the first episode of this series on polarization, we define the term and explain the roles of psychology and biology in the manifestation of this behavior in everyday human beings. Let's say we accept that polarization is just a part of our natures. Is it necessarily a bad thing? And how does it affect our society at large? Well, let's revisit our fictitious everyman, Jim. It's a standard weekday, and before dinner, Jim takes the family pooch out for a walk. He spies his neighbor Stanley out watering his flowers, and immediately, a sense of dread washes over Jim. Stanley and Jim used to be great friends. Countless times, Jim had helped Stanley carry new furniture into his house, or had watered his prized petunias when Stanley and his wife were out of town. Sure, they had different opinions on a lot of things, but that was never an issue when they were barbecuing and drinking a few beers in the backyard. But that last election? That changed things. It started when Stanley plastered his yard and home with all those ugly political signs. When Jim made a crack about it, Stanley barked at him and jumped down his throat. "Don't you care about your children's future? You want to see this country flush down the toilet?" And since then, they've judiciously avoided each other. So Jim just looks straight ahead as he walks smutly, hoping he doesn't make eye contact with the old grump. Sound familiar? Is this something you can relate to? We know there will always be differences in opinion between people, but again, it begs the question, is that necessarily a bad thing? Or, put another way, when does it become a bad thing? Clay Routledge is the Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute.
Polarization by itself isn't necessarily concerning if you just think about it as a society has different groups in it and they have different opinions or positions that are often in conflict, and that isn't always bad. But where polarization becomes concerning is when we see it as a barrier to actually getting anything done. So you could imagine like two teams in an organization working on a goal for that organization. Well, if they were constantly doing things to harm each other's progress on that goal just so their team could be the one that wins, in the end, that's going to harm the organizational goals. So the competition between the two teams can be very, very good, right? Because it might push each team to do better work. But it becomes a problem to the extent that people start using tactics that are really more about harming the other team than about really competing fairly with them. And so that's how I think of polarization as potentially harmful.
Jim likes to have fun at work, and he sometimes plays silly pranks on his coworkers. But he had to scale it back when his rival salesman Dwight just took it way too seriously, especially during the snowball fight of 2019. That one ended in Jim with a bloodied face and nose. There's always that one person who takes rivalries a little too far, whether at a Super Bowl party or a team-building office outing, or even just a friendly discussion about the latest superhero movie at a group dinner. But what's the alternative? To never play a prank? Never go to a sporting event? Never have any sort of contentious discussion? Dan Vallone is the U.S. Director for the nonprofit research organization More in Common.
The intent is never to just reduce polarization for the sake of reducing polarization, right? In a diverse pluralistic society, we're going to have disagreements, and we should. That's what drives growth and pushes us to new ideas, et cetera. So we're not trying to obscure disagreement, but we're trying to situate it in the context where we are reminded of what we have in common. And so we can pursue solutions, recognizing that in our societies, we are bound by a shared fate, right? Like that we, as Americans, we share a common fate to a certain extent. And by remembering that, we're better able to make progress on the challenges that we face as a country. And that's true in whatever society we're in. So we're not trying to obscure difference. We're trying to make it possible to make progress in the face of differences and use them constructively.
A common fate is a great way to put it, and a great way to remind ourselves of the costs of division. But beyond polarization when it comes to sports and opinions on movies and goofy pranks at the office, there's a whole other level of hell called politics. Combined with the tribalism that we discussed in episode 1 and the accompanying push to isolate from those we disagree with, polarized politics becomes a very volatile beast, empowered by fear, emotion, and cults of personality. Ben Klutsey is the director of the program on pluralism and civil exchange at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University.
We have to think about polarization in a couple of different terms. I'm thinking of political polarization, which is, I think, what preoccupies a lot of our thinking these days. And we have political polarization, which we've had in U.S. history and history around the world for a very, very long time, which is basically the ideological distance between opposing political parties. And, you look at platforms of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you can tell that they're diametrically opposed. And I think that's normal. It's normal that, when people have different political ideologies, they will be quite different in the way that they state them and how they carry out their politics. What we're seeing now is a phenomenon that Robert Talisse calls belief polarization, which has beset the political parties themselves. So belief polarization comes about when people who are spending a lot of time with the same kinds of people who think the same way, who shop in the same places, who fellowship in the same religious institutions, and so on and so forth, they begin to hold the extreme versions of their original views. So the more you spend time with someone and you're saying the same thing, you're kind of urging each other on, you switch from your initial sort of views and then you begin to take on more and more extreme versions of your views. And I think that's where the danger comes in when we talk about polarization, because I think that we're now moving away from, I just really dislike what that politician is saying. I really don't stand for any of the views that the political party holds, but I really dislike that person. In fact, I strongly dislike and hate the people who support this person who holds these views. And I think that level of polarization is damaging.
Ilana Redstone is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and the faculty director of the Mill Institute at the University of Austin in Texas.
It's sort of hard to overstate the impacts of that, because what you're talking about is when you're at this place where conversations on all of these things basically are stuck and you're at some sort of impasse. I don't want to talk to this person because I think they're horrible and that, this is the whole bigots and snowflakes thing. This is the language that I've used just because it seems to paint a clear picture. You're talking about an erosion of trust, right? And the erosion of trust both at the individual level and at the societal level, in the sense that if you and I see things differently, I'm blue, you're red, or vice versa, or whatever, and I sort of view you as judging me, demonizing me, whatever. And by judgment, I mean specifically sort of the kind of judgment that condemns someone's character. Like, that doesn't engender goodwill, right? Across, just to state the obvious, like, it doesn't engender goodwill across differences. It breeds resentment. And so when you think about, and why does that matter? Well, societies that have low levels of trust have all kinds of problems. If I'm living in a community with somebody, one of the reasons that I would help that person in a particular situation is if I think that if the tables were turned, they would reciprocate. We're talking about at sort of the lower community level. All of that depends on trust. We don't trust people that we think are demonizing us. I don't care where it's coming from on the political spectrum.
Indeed, as Jim continues to walk his dog past his neighbor and former friend Stanley, a dark thought settles on his mind. Jim is often away on business trips, and if something unspeakable happens to his family while he's away, a fire, a medical emergency, a robbery, he's always known and trusted that Stanley and his wife would be there for them. But is that still true? Can Jim still count on Stanley? Should he? Clay Routledge on even more psychological levels of how we deal with extreme situations.
Decades ago, psychologists discovered that when you think about human motivation, there's kind of a general model that you can use that I refer to as defense versus growth. Other people have called it avoidance versus approach. You can get even more nerdy, and there are kind of neuroscientists who use words like the behavioral inhibition system versus the behavioral activation system. But the commonality between all these ways of framing defense versus growth is the notion that some of the activities that we pursue involve avoiding harm, and some of the activities we pursue involve approaching gains. And so avoiding harm is defense, right? We want to protect ourselves. Approaching gains is growth. Like we want to expand, we want to accumulate more. Both are important, as it turns out, and it makes sense from just a basic survival point of view. If there's some threats in the environment, that's not like necessarily the best time to go out in the world and explore and try new things and try to meet new people and things like that, right? You want to pull back, check things out, make sure things are safe. And so you need to defend yourself. But if you did that all the time, if you were just in a constant state of paralysis because you were in a defensive mindset, then you're never going to learn anything. You're never going to grow. You're never going to go out into the world and build new skills, build new relationships, and take the types of risks that ultimately end up leading to a flourishing life. So there's a balance between these two motivational orientations.
This is a very important point. When you're standing there with your spears in hand, pointed at the entrance to your cave, waiting, expecting a wild predator or a marauding rival tribe to attack, you won't have time to rub a couple of sticks together and discover fire. Clay continues.
Within the field of social psychology and increasingly in related disciplines such as political science, there's growing interest in this concept of social trust. I'll take a step back a little. Psychologists originally thought about trust in a more interpersonal way. And what I mean by that, and everyone can kind of understand this, is we know it's important to trust people that we're close to, right? We like to have a feeling that we can trust family members, that we can trust romantic partners, that we can trust our close friends and colleagues. And the idea behind that is we want to feel like we can reveal things about ourselves and that they won't be used against us. In fact, that people have our best interests in mind and they will help us. So if I'm going through a particular challenge in my life or, dealing with something, it's nice to feel like, well, I can talk to my wife, I can trust her, I can talk to my other family members, I can talk to coworkers and trust them. In an environment in which you can't trust people that are close to you, you don't feel supported, right? You're going to be anxious. You're not going to want to reveal anything that might be used against you. And that kind of cultivates a personal life environment that's a little bit paranoid, highly anxious, kind of feeling like everyone's out to get you. And you can imagine that that's not healthy personally. So now think about that, but at the broader societal level. Obviously, it's very, very important to be able to trust the people closest to you. But it turns out it's actually pretty important to be able to trust strangers as well. Like you go to a restaurant, you order your food, you eat before you get the bill because the restaurant has some sense of trust that you're going to pay that bill, that you're not going to dine and dash. And imagine a society in which that doesn't exist, in which the kind of base cognitive model for navigating the social world is everyone's out to stick it to you, that around every corner is danger. People are just looking for ways to cut you down. That's a distrustful society. And you can imagine how bad that would be for economics, for social health, for community engagement. That's an environment that's just like you can imagine not having a healthy family or close relationship environment because you can't trust anyone. Imagine like living in a society where no one trusts anyone. And so this is why I think political scientists are getting increasingly interested in this concept that psychologists have been interested in for a long time, because they realize that this happens. The benefits of trust extend beyond our personal networks into our broader societal interactions, at the economic, social, cultural, and professional levels. It requires so much more time and energy to navigate the world if you don't have a high sense of social trust, because you're vetting everything yourself, or you're relying more heavily on legal protections or other kind of legal or regulatory infrastructure because you just don't trust your fellow citizens. And that obviously can really slow down the machinery of just normal social life.
Ilana Redstone expands on this notion of social trust.
But then you also have institutional trust, right? You have this loss of trust in institutions, which is also tied to polarization, both as a cause and an effect. If you think about why do we care about trust? Why do we care about trust in institutions? And what are we talking about when we're talking about trust in institutions? We care about having a citizenry that is largely compliant with tax regulation, with property law, with all of the things that are required for sort of governing a society. We care about people having some degree of trust in the legal system. I'm not claiming it's perfect, but we care about enough people having a sense that if I break this law, even if I don't agree with it, something bad is going to happen to me. I'm going to get caught. I'm going to get punished. And if I don't break this law, I'm going to be largely left alone. Again, I'm not suggesting that the system is perfect or that it doesn't have flaws or couldn't be improved, but you need some level of trust in it. You need some level of trust in our education system. You need trust for students. And if you're just talking about higher education, I need to have some sense of legitimacy that whatever I walk out with after 4 years is going to leave me better off than before I walked in. Parents who are paying for the education want to know that. Employers who are hiring also need to have some. So all of this sense of sort of legitimacy and trust in our institutions matters. And the more polarized we are, the further apart we are, the less we're communicating on all kinds of things, the more this trust starts to decline.
If you take a moment and reflect on the past several years, would you agree that your own level of trust in society, your fellow citizens, your government has decreased? We touched on it in episode 1, but this feeling of a growing chasm and plummeting trust isn't dependent on whether our perceived differences are real or not. Tony Woodlief is the Senior Executive Vice President with State Policy Network and author of I, Citizen, a blueprint for reclaiming American self-governance.
So one of the things that troubles me, the first part of the book, I, Citizen, I'm walking through all this data to say, look, most Americans are not that politically divided. But then I do point out there is a subset that is divided and bitter, and that number is growing. And we don't have very good data about the rate of growth. But my hunch is it's growing faster than we realize. And that means we do have a problem if this polarization and overt focus on politics continues among regular Americans. And I estimated it's around 20% of Americans are really invested in their political party and partisanship and really do hate the other side. So what I suggested is, part of the problem is when people make their partisanship and their ideology one of the most important parts of their identity.
And when politics becomes so ingrained in our way of thinking, it will absolutely affect our daily lives as well, in every possible way. Ben Klutsey.
People have more negative views of inter-party marriages than interracial or interfaith and any of those things. There's a good chunk of Republicans and Democrats who say it'd be fine if the folks who support the other party kind of died off, right? I think that those are dangerous places to be. And I think that's where polarization can be dangerous, because the truth of the matter is that there are lots of policy issues where people can find common ground on. Right. I think people agree on a lot of the policy issues, the key policy issues. But when the politics emerges, then we become very polarized. And there are so many problems to address and solve that polarization actually limits our ability to solve those things. And in a democratic society, I think that we need opportunities to engage with one another in ways that aren't extremely polarized, so that we can move forward on a lot of policy issues and a lot of things that really concern society more broadly.
Dan Vallone.
Identity-based polarization fuels a self-defeating and a harmful cycle of dehumanization. So we get locked in these cycles where the motivating driver in politics is the demonization of the other side. And that makes it impossible for anybody to govern. If you are elected primarily because of the ways in which you will attack the other side, it is not a mandate to govern, and you obviously create the conditions for a lot of opposition. And then obviously it fuels real violence. And we have seen this unfortunately play out in multiple societies, is that what might start as harmful rhetoric all too often leads to behaviors and actions that harm people.
It's probable that this notion of engaging with one another just plainly sounds impossible to some of you, that we're so far past any notion of working together that violence is maybe even regrettably inevitable because we're just that far apart now. But what if that's just an illusion? Tony Woodlief has a very interesting theory about this that may just shock you.
When you look at where people array on these spectrums, whether it's an ideological spectrum or an issue-specific one, like, should we intervene in countries around the world with our military or stay at home? Or should we give people more welfare or less welfare? When you look at average Americans, they cluster towards the middle of these bands, and they have for decades. So what we end up confusing is that our political class, so the folks in Washington, D.C., politicians, the people who work in politics, their consultants, their advisors, their donors, their activists, those people have become much more polarized, meaning that the extremity of their views is greater. But we've seen what's called party sorting, which means, if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, you could find plenty of people who were like pro-gun Democrats, or who were pro-choice and pro-environment Republicans. You could belong in the party. You could still fit in and even find candidates to vote for, depending on where you lived, and have a diversity of views. But the extremes in those parties have sort of forced a sorting. And on a multitude of issues like that, you end up with the parties being so well sorted. And so it looks like, golly, the Republicans and Democrats don't agree on anything, which is true. But when you look at the underlying beliefs of Americans, those are still pretty stable. It's just that they've sorted themselves into the two parties, which have become very intolerant of dissent. And then the mistake commentators make is they look at that and they go, oh my gosh, Americans are more divided than ever. Well, no, not really. They're not. It's just if you're center left, there's really no option for you now but Democrats up and down the party ticket. And if you're center right, there's no option for you now but Republicans up and down the ticket. So you look like you're a hardcore Republican or a hardcore Democrat because you vote that way every election. That's really not because you, the average American, have changed, have become more extreme since the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's that the parties really give you no choice.
It's not me, it's not you, it's them. Is what Tony is claiming difficult to believe? Given the brutal incentives politicians have to amass power, money, influence, do your conflicts with that guy wearing the t-shirt with the slogan you don't like, or your coworkers' ridiculous ideas at lunch seem a lot less important? But even if we accept Tony's claim, how are we polarized by an elite group of politicians? It's not like they have some sort of mind control ray. Or do they? Tony Woodlief continues.
With the rise of the importance of media, money becomes more important than ever. You have the collapse of journalism, so that, there's a strong incentive for journalists and media to give the most attention to the most extreme and outrageous candidates. These are not reasonable, intelligent people, but they're very attractive to media, so they get outsized media. So if you, a reasonable candidate, want to challenge one of these people, you're up against a very extreme donor class that has no room for compromise. And their interests, we know from polls, are widely at odds with the interests of average Americans, both Republican and Democrat donors. You're up against their sort of activist base that gets out the vote. And then you're up against a media that loves the extremists.
But what about traditional media's kissing cousin, social media? Dan Vallone.
I would say that Americans are pretty convinced social media is contributing to polarization, that public opinion-wise, that's a pretty common sentiment. I think if you look at the academic space, there's a lot more debate about the measurability and what the data actually says about the role of social media. I'm not an expert in measuring social media explicitly, and I think it's also so nascent that there's still a degree to which we should be cautious in assigning or arriving at any firm conclusions that attribute to social media some sort of decisive impact on polarization. All that is to say, I think social media is definitely contributing to polarization. I would say that what we know is that the most ideologically charged Americans are much more likely to share political content, and that political content then gets picked up by many different media outlets.
The media may seem to be everyone's favorite punching bag these days, but the upheaval that traditional outlets like printed news, televised broadcasts, and radio signals faced with the advent of the internet really did disrupt things dramatically and in unexpected ways. Jim doesn't pick up the daily paper in his bathrobe in the morning, nor does he turn on the TV in the morning to catch the morning news while eating his breakfast. Instead, he scrolls various feeds on his phone or iPad, where much of everything he sees and reads is punctuated by emojis and likes and frowny faces. It's not journalism that he consumes, but filtered, adulterated outbursts from random strangers on the internet, organized by mysterious and inscrutable algorithms whose only goal is to keep him scrolling. So although it may be fashionable to point and laugh at the obviously biased news anchors and pundits on TV, or roll your eyes at the latest absurd headline on virtually every news website, are we truly mad at them or at the technology that uprooted tradition? Dan Vallone continues.
So we are seeing the ways in which social media allows for content to go viral in a way that was just previously not possible, and to go viral in multiple mediums. So what starts in social media doesn't stay in social media. It lives in kind of conventional news outlets. It gets published in print and digital, and then gets repeated through social networks in person. So I think the algorithms that are so sensitive to what can get likes and shares definitely contributes to highly charged content going viral and shaping people's picture of what politics is like. So again, I think I'm probably a little bit more cautious. I'm relatively to lots of folks. I think like it's understandable. We should be a little bit cautious. We should study a lot more. But I think at this point in time, we know enough to say that there's a lot of negative effects in terms of the relationship our society has with social media and its impact on pluralism and social cohesion. Both, our perception gap study showed, again, that there's a tight relationship there. More broadly, the most ideological segments in our typology, the progressive activists and doer conservatives, much more likely to share political content. And, I think that when that becomes what people perceive as the norm, when people take social media as descriptive of people in general, it again diminishes their propensity to try and work across the aisle, because they're convinced that everybody on the other side is not just extreme in their views, but hates them, right? Holds hatred and contempt for them. And so again, I think we need to figure out ways to disrupt or diffuse these false perceptions we hold about each other. And it would be great if we could find a way to arrive at a healthier relationship with social media where this phenomena didn't happen as much, where truthful, more accurate, more representative content was more regularly made available in the same way that hypercharged and divisive content is now.
Clay Routledge.
And thanks to social media, as well as just kind of clickbait media in general, we tend to overestimate the number of people that are at the extremes. And so we tend to think, like most Democrats are like hardcore social justice activists on the far left, or most Republicans are, far right populists. When it turns out those are actually really, really small percentages of the Republican and Democrat groups.
So the research is showing that a smaller number of extremists are drastically skewing the numbers and the perceptions in everyday society. But is that true about all aspects and corners of our world? Ben Klutsey.
There is some interesting research that shows that there is a lot more polarization at the elite levels of our institutions. And I think academia is one of them. And there have been some interesting research done on what the political views of professors are. And I think majority of the time, you'll find that professors vote Democrat. Now, voting Democrat or being liberal versus conservative doesn't necessarily mean that you're a lot more polarized. But there is an indication we're seeing across college campuses where, students are self-censoring. Part of the reason is because they're self-censoring amongst conversation with your students, but they also self-censor because they worry about what their professors might say or think, or how they might treat their grades if they understood their actual thinking. The challenge in academia is stepping away from sort of single theories. Ilana Redstone wrote a book called Unassailable Ideas. She co-authored with John Villasenor. And in that book, they talk about some of the ideas that are in academia right now that, unfortunately, you cannot raise any questions about. And I think that in academia, especially where we're supposed to have open inquiry, civil discourse, where we can challenge orthodoxies and so on, it's unfortunate that there are certain ideas that you cannot challenge. And I think that in academia, the goal there should be helping students to think about multiple lenses through which they can understand the world. I was very fortunate to have had a professor in college who, would always take different sides of arguments. You never really knew where they stood on any particular thing. And I remember that in a lot of our essays, especially in philosophy, he was a philosophy professor, he would say, you pick a topic and you say, what's the best possible case you can make for X, right? That's the alpha section of your project. And then for the beta section of the project, he would say, please give the best possible case against the case that you made in alpha. And he will note that if you create a straw man for alpha so you can easily take down beta, that would actually go against you. So you lose points for that. And I think that is the kind of thing that really forces students to kind of switch between different ideas, different views, different frameworks of looking at the world, and taking other ideas that they may disagree with very, very seriously, and think about ways in which you can critique them. John Stuart Mill said that he who knows only one side of the case knows very little of it. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but I think it captures the essence of what I'm trying to say, that you ought to have different frameworks, different lenses, understand even the viewpoints that you disagree with very, very well, because that's the only way you can actually even challenge them. And John Stuart Mill also says that the ideas that we hold on to so dearly, when they are never challenged and never get any pushback, we begin to forget why we even hold on to those ideas, and they become dead dogma.
Clay Routledge.
This is kind of like a micro example of that, is we're seeing a lot of problems on American college campuses related to what sometimes is referred to as like cancel culture, or, where people are shouting down speakers and students and professors are afraid to discuss certain ideas. And I think it's generally recognized that that is undermining the success of American academic institutions, because instead of really pushing the frontiers of science and technology, a lot of time is being spent worrying about, are your colleagues going to try to get you fired, or students going to try to get you fired? And in that environment of fear and, just a general defensive mindset, you're not going to see a lot of innovation, and you're not going to see the American university as a place where like new ideas are really being tested or generated. You're not going to see it as a space for creativity and innovation. You're going to see it as a place of stagnation. You're going to see it as a toxic climate of fear. We don't want our American universities to look like that. Unfortunately, that seems to be the trend. But we don't want our country to look like that even more, right? That'd be even worse if you scaled that out to the national level. In a future in which polarization only becomes worse and Americans become less trustful of each other and more like what's referred to as affective polarization, like really emotionally dislike people who have different politics, we'll become our own worst enemies. Instead of competing with other countries, for instance, on trying to advance certain innovations or to be global leaders on certain issues, we're going to be too busy fighting with each other, fighting with ourselves. A society in which there's high levels of distrust will mean that we're spending more and more time in kind of a defensive mindset. We're worried about, we have to protect our own, we have to look after ourselves. We have to be hyper vigilant, that everyone's trying to get us.
That certainly sounds like a future no reasonable person would want, one doomed to infighting and spiraling downwards. But that's the reality of polarization when it gets out of hand and pushes people to extremes, where you couldn't find a reasonable person within sight. So the vitally important question really is, can we course correct this ship called America? Thank you for joining us for this second episode of True Progress Polarization, presented by Perfectus Magazine. For more information, visit perfectusmag.com and sign up for our newsletter to make sure you never miss an article. And please tune in for our third and final episode in this series, where we explore solutions and ideas to get us away from this division and towards a more harmonious future.